Hi, I'm Dr. Jacob M. Appel, and I'm the Director of Ethics Education in Psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine here in New York City at Mount Sinai. And I'm here to talk today about the psychedelic revolution and to answer the question, or try to answer the question, can hallucinogenic drugs transform medicine? And the short answer is I think they can, and I want to take you through their history, ethics, and implications for medical and psychiatric care today. I want to emphasize that nothing in this lecture is intended to constitute medical advice. If you have any medical concerns, I strongly suggest marrying a physician. The goals of the presentation today are first to review the history of hallucinogenic substances, then to examine current data on the potential for these substances in treating mental illness, and then finally, to consider the legal and ethical issues that continue to make access to such potential treatments challenging for most Americans. Before I get there, though, I want to begin with a pedagogical joke. And I tell you in advance it's a joke because I'm a bioethicist, not a comedian. And if I didn't tell you, you might not know, but it does serve a pedagogical purpose. A couple go to the doctor and the husband goes in to get his medical exam done, a routine physical, and he dies in the office. And needless to say, his wife is devastated by this. And she asked the doctor, what happened? Was it his heart? And the doctor says, I'm sorry, ma'am, it was psychedelic drugs. And now the woman is both horrified and shocked because, as she says to the doctor, my husband never in his life touched any drugs, let alone psychedelic drugs. And the doctor says, I'm sure he didn't, but I do. I might get a laugh or a snicker, but the key point here, pedagogically, is psychedelics are going to increasingly permeate our society in various ways. And we want to be able to think about their implications both ethically and practically. Before I go any further, I want to tell you a tale from my own clinic or my own ER. The facts have been changed slightly to protect the innocent, or in this case, also the guilty, so they can't be individually identified. But the case history itself is entirely true. And it involves a young man who, to celebrate his graduation from a very prestigious college a couple of years ago, gathered together his friends, and they drove to Mexico. And they did the usual things that college graduates do in Mexico. They went out to the bars and drank beer. They went to the beaches and got a suntan. They met potential romantic partners. And they bought a rare exotic Sonoran desert toad in order to experience the high of ingesting the bufo toxin. I say the last part jokingly because most of your children and grandchildren who go to Mexico will not do that. This is a story of a graduation celebration gone wrong. Bufotenin, which is a tyramine-derived neurotransmitter serotonin, is found in the glands of certain amphibians, including the Sonoran desert toad, and it causes an hallucinogenic high. And it starts in about 20 minutes, it can last up to 24 hours. In their wisdom, these young men smuggled the toad back into the United States, which I will add is a felony and subject one to a long prison sentence if caught. They, rather than distilling the substance appropriately as one does to get the high, had a party and they passed the toad around like you might pass around a joint of marijuana, and they licked the back and salivary glands of it. And some of them got very high, and a few hours later were no longer high. And the young man in question ended up in the psychiatric emergency room because several days later he was still high, because it turned out that his body did not have the enzyme to break down the bufotoxin. I tell you that because there are significant medical implications for these, and most people don't know about them, and we are on the tip of the iceberg of changing society as a result. So what is the moral of the toad tale? The moral of the toad tale is there's a right way and a wrong way to use or experiment with hallucinogenic substances. And I want to make sure that all of us are headed in the right direction. Before we get any further, what are hallucinogens? And the man who really defined the concept was a psychiatrist first at Stanford and later at Texas named Leo Hollister. And Hollister said there are 5 criteria that make a hallucinogen different from other drugs. And the 5, known now as the Hollister criteria, are in proportion to other effects. The changes are primarily psychiatric and on thought, mood, and perception. They don't generally affect or impair memory in a significant way. They don't generally lead to unconsciousness or stupor or narcosis, nor do they lead to elevated or excess energy or mood. They generally don't have autonomic side effects, so they don't affect the blood pressure, the heart rate as their primary effects. And finally, and most interesting, they generally don't produce an addictive craving, as many other drugs and illicit substances do. There are three kinds of hallucinogens. I'm going to mention the first two briefly, and then we're going to talk at greater length about psychedelics. So the first kind are known as dissociatives, and the name captures the essence of how they affect people. They cause analgesia. To some degree, they can cause amnesia. The most well-known of these, for example, are ketamine, which used to be a horse tranquilizer, but is now used for treatment of acute depression and suicidality. Nitrous oxide, which you may experience at the dentist's office. Dextromethorphan, which is in a lot of cough suppressants. And then more traditional remedies like salvia and ibogaine. Their medical uses other than ketamine are fairly limited. Then there are the deliriants, which are even more limited in their likelihood of transforming medicine. They cause delirium, they can cause hallucinations. In low doses, they can serve certain medical properties. Benadryl, diphenhydramine, for example, is one of them. Uncured tobacco, which I do not encourage you to consume, has a similar effect. And then finally, the class of hallucinogens we are going to talk about today are psychedelics. And they cause primarily alterations or expansions of consciousness. And the ones you're probably most familiar with, although there are a number both naturally occurring and synthetic, are LSD, DMT or ayahuasca, mescaline, related to peyote, and psilocin, which is a derivative of psilocybin. Psychedelics are sometimes called classical hallucinogens. So unfortunately, the term psychedelics and hallucinogens are often used interchangeably. And I would emphasize this is incorrect, even though the media does it. Psychedelics are a class of hallucinogenic drugs or hallucinogenic substances. And I want to talk about each one of these major psychedelics individually, and then we'll finally focus on psilocybin and psilocin, which I think have the most medicinal promise. So the first and probably the most well-known psychedelic is LSD. Anybody who grew up in the 1960s, whether you used it or not, is familiar with it. Lysergic acid diethylamide. It was discovered by Albert Hofmann, who was a Swiss chemist at Sandoz in 1938. He was actually trying to make an analeptic, a stimulant that only affected the heart and the nervous system and not the reproductive system. And it had larger effects than he anticipated. He accidentally absorbed LSD through his fingers in 1943 and enjoyed a very good trip, which made him think maybe he could ingest the same substance intentionally. And he dosed 250 micrograms and then went on a bicycle ride and had a terrible trip, a terrible hallucinogenic experience on what is known as April 19th, 1943 as Bicycle Day. And if you are a LSD aficionado or user, Bicycle Day is D-Day, Independence Day. The birthday of LSD is a popular consuming substance. The first uses of LSD, unfortunately, were for truly nefarious purposes. During the 1950s and early 1960s, the federal government, particularly the CIA, under a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, tried to use LSD as a tool for assessing the ability of mind control for Soviet agents. They experimented upon prisoners, on psychiatric patients, on sex workers, often with no meaningful consent or no consent at all. Their program was known as MK Ultra, or rather was a subset of a larger program known as MK Ultra that was eventually shut down and exposed during the 1970s. Probably its most disturbing aspects included Operation Midnight Climax. You wonder who names these studies for the government. The CIA hired prostitutes in New York City and San Francisco to drug unsuspecting clients with LSD and then question them while doctors and agents watched through one-way mirrors. This is your tax dollars in action. And then one of the most tragic episodes, Frank Olson, who was both a CIA scientist and a subject in one of these experiments, jumped out a window after his drink was spiked with LSD. And the details of his tragedy remain unclear and possibly covered up to this day. I imagine you're all familiar with Timothy Leary, the Harvard professor turned guru for LSD. He was eventually fired by Harvard in 1963 for giving LSD to his undergraduates. The phrase you're probably most familiar with in regard to Leary is his mantra, turn on, tune in, drop out. But it was a different feature of Harvard's psilocybin project that probably is more relevant to the impact of these drugs. And that is setting and set and setting. That is the belief that your mindset, how you set your mind up to use the drug, and then the setting, the environment in which you use the drug shape your experience. And later on, another researcher, Hubbard, would develop Hubbard rooms to create the right appropriate setting to get a good trip and the full hallucinogenic experience. And needless to say, Leary was a highly controversial figure. Allen Ginsberg called him the hero of American consciousness, and Richard Nixon called him the most dangerous man in America, and it's arguably possible he was both. LSD became a staple of 1960s counterculture. Some of you have probably read Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, in which he describes the experiences of novelist Ken Kesey and his band of merry pranksters who hosted parties in San Francisco known as acid tests that featured both LSD and performances by the Grateful Dead. It's a sense of action. But how does it actually work? So LSD works on the neurotransmitters serotonin and dopamine. You're probably familiar with both of these from more general commentary about psychiatric medication. You've heard of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, which treat antidepression. What's interesting is, unlike most psychedelics, which work on just serotonin, LSD also works on dopamine, which is involved heavily in the reward centers in the brain. And the benefits, or supposed benefits, are ego dissolution, mystical transcendence, the depth of consciousness. The downside is LSD is very poorly suited for therapeutics. Why? Because you develop a tolerance fairly quickly in a therapeutic setting. So the first or second time you may get this experience, but if you use it every day, you're not likely to have the same experience. It wears off. There are also significant side effects: paranoia, delusion, severe anxiety, and there are some long-term risks. Some people who use LSD significantly develop chronic visual hallucinations, such as visual static, the sense of snow in front of them, like snow on the television screen in the old days when they have the holding patterns, or images that don't remove once you remove the stimulus. Another psychedelic, which in theory would have therapeutic potential but is not used as often, is mescaline. Mescaline is a naturally occurring product that occurs in New World cacti, including the peyote cactus, though other cactuses too, like the Peruvian and Bolivian torch cacti. It has a historical significance because it was used in both South and Central America more than 5,500 years ago, and possibly longer, as part of a number of Aztec rituals, but also more recently in the ghost dances of 19th century Plains Indians, like the Lakota Agala. Why I mention this is twofold. One, it was not part of their traditional historic practice. It joined their practice around the same time they were coming into conflict with settlers, that is, the Sioux in the Northern Plains. But it was also fear of the ghost dances that led to a backlash in the late 19th century against Sitting Bull and his followers that ultimately culminated in the tragedy of the massacre of Wounded Knee. So it was the suppression of ghost dances as much as the appropriation of land that played a role in that tragedy. And mescaline played a large role in both the ghost dances themselves and the settlers and the military's objection to them. It was introduced to the American public, or the Anglo-American public, by Brave New World novelist Aldous Huxley in his memoir, The Doors of Perception, in which he explains his own experiences using mescaline and becomes a lifelong champion. A synthetic version was developed as early as 1919 by Ernst Spaeth. Unlike LSD, which acts on dopamine and serotonin, it acts primarily on serotonin, which, as you may recall, is the same substance that is implicated in antidepressants. And it has distinctive effects like loss of time perception, synesthesia. People describe objects appearing as geometric shapes. And even though it's been used in traditional medicine for thousands of years, there are very few meaningful clinical trials, and therefore it's understudied, and there's a lack of understanding on exactly what the appropriate dosing is and how it can be best be medicalized. Unlike LSD, one of its major advantages is not associated with flashbacks. The downsides, though, are similar. You can get nausea and vomiting, increased pulse and blood pressure, and there have been several popular media stories recently in significant doses, particularly in vulnerable populations, it can be associated with esophageal hemorrhages. A third psychedelic, DMT, known on Mistreatus Dimitri, or in the lab as N,N-dimethyltryptamine, is found in a number of Latin American plants. Mimosa, chacruna. It's the primary ingredient of ayahuasca, which is ceremonially given in teas in the Amazon basin. It's often known as a business trip because it's a quick on, quick off, rapid metabolism psychedelic. It is the drug, as I mentioned, that is found in the parotid glands of a number of amphibians. It can be inhaled, it can be insufflated, where somebody else blows it into your nose, and it can also be ingested, though the dosing is hard to manage. Unlike those three substances, the substance with probably the best potential for medicalization is psilocybin. And psilocybin occurs naturally in a number of fungi species, hence the term magic mushrooms. Psilocybin itself is inactive, it does absolutely nothing. But in the brain, it breaks down to psilocin, where it acts on the same serotonin transporters, but in different ways. And you can see a map on the right, you can see where the mushrooms that contain psychedelics grow, and the answer is almost everywhere, so you can go out into the right field and find them. But it also occurs synthetically, and Hoffman isolated it first in 1959. After his work on LSD, he switched to psilocybin, and it's now available in many forms, many durations. It is one of the illicit or hallucinogenic substances with the largest range of available forms. It is well known in popular culture. Every child who has read Alice in Wonderland by Lewis and Carroll is familiar with the magic mushrooms that Alice ingests, probably based on fly agaric mushrooms that make her large and make her small. And if you missed out on Alice in Wonderland, maybe in the 1960s, you heard Jefferson Airplane's classic album, White Rabbit. And then, of course, there's a far more negative portrayal in Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers. So psilocybin has a cultural following that predates and to some degree at present still dwarfs over its medicinal uses. It also has a history as a recreational drug. The man behind this was R.G. Wasson, who of all things was vice president for public relations at J.B. Morgan, not the man you'd expect to become the poster boy for psilocybin use. But he was also an amateur ethnomycologist. Basically, he was interested in the cultural uses of fungi and mushrooms. And he developed this interest on his honeymoon in the Catskills in 1967, pursued his research for many years as an amateur, and in 1957 published a photo essay in Life magazine called Seeking the Magic Mushroom, about using psilocybin in Mexico, that brought the subject into American living rooms and started a craze. And then, a generation later, Terry McKenna released a very user-friendly how-to book on psilocybin, The Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, which is still in print and available. I neither endorse nor deny the efficacy of his suggestions. But I will mention that many people who use substances do rely on this book still. And there are many people who use these substances. I think Michael Pollan, the food writer, author of The Omnivore's Dilemma, wrote a best-selling book, How to Change Your Mind, that really made ordinary Americans aware of this recently. But celebrities have tapped into psilocybin for a while now. So Mike Tyson famously said, once I got introduced to the shrooms, my whole life changed. I will leave for you to decide for better or for worse. And that is Chelsea Handler, the comedian, another popular advocate for the substances, who says, psilocybin is good for everybody. It puts you in a good mood, keeps you upbeat, and makes sure you appreciate nature. You've probably also seen lots of headlines about microdosing, which is using psilocybin in very, very small doses, almost homeopathic ones, to create psychological effects. You can look at some of these headlines. CBS says microdosing magic mushrooms, a growing trend among San Diego moms. Or the Daily Mail, how microdosing magic mushrooms can treat depression in radical new therapy. And The Guardian, people microdosing on psychedelics to improve well-being during the pandemic. In short, it is everywhere. I cannot provide you advice on how to micromanage or how to manage microdosing, primarily because I don't want to go to prison. But I assure you that after this lecture, if you type microdosing to the internet, you will be bombarded with more information than you could possibly want to know. There are a number of non-medical effects of psilocybin. Some of them are physical, such as nausea and vomiting, which are the product of the breakdown. Can also cause hypertension in some individuals and can cause panic, but less so. The more interesting phenomenon is it's an entheogen, if you ever want a good word for the crossword puzzle, which means it is a substance that creates a sensation that time is stopped, and it's an inducer of spiritual experiences. What's interesting is lifetime users of psychedelics have long been correlated with personality openness. But historically, it was hard, and you can see a graph on the right that shows that, but it's hard to know which came first, whether people who are open to new experiences were willing to try psilocybin, or whether people who tried psilocybin then became open to new experiences. And one of the questions that our data is going to try to answer is which came first, the openness or the psilocybin. We're going to talk a bit about psilocybin as medicine. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy dates as far back as the 1950s. It was championed by an English-Canadian named Humphrey Osmond, who works in Saskatchewan. Initially, psychedelics were given in conjunction with psychotherapy. You went to your psychiatrist, you lay down on the couch, you took some psychedelics, then he, believing he made you more susceptible, you were more open to talk therapy, and you did traditional analysis. And a number of famous people engaged in this practice, including Cary Grant. And although the term psychedelic was initially coined by Osmond, it was popularized by Grant, who underwent this kind of therapy under Dr. Mortimer Hartman. And eventually, the psychotherapy elements dissipated, and only the psychedelic experience remained. I've talked to you for 25 minutes in the abstract about theory, about history, about things you already knew about from your own college experiences. What you want to know is, does psilocybin and do psychedelics really work for medicinal purposes, and what are the implications? And here's the good news for you. The good news is there are about 20 studies now addressing various aspects of psychedelics. And I have read all of these studies, so you don't have to. I haven't cherry-picked them. I'm giving you all the data available, but there are a number of caveats. There are a limited number of studies overall because the government significantly regulates research in this area. Most of them feature a very small number of participants, dozens, not hundreds, and they are possibly non-representative samples because the kind of people who either have access to these studies or willing to enroll in these studies may not be representative of the general population. I can assure you that my elderly Jewish law-abiding grandmother, if she's having a bout of depression, might be persuaded to take an SSRI. There is no way she's going to be persuaded to take a substance she associates with hippies in the counterculture. So there's a selection effect. First question researchers looked at is, do psychedelics improve patients with depression? And the short answer is, in the studies that are done, yes. So one study gave psilocybin to 27 subjects with long-standing depression, either immediately or after 8 weeks, and measured scores about depression over 1 year. And it's worth noting that Tim Ferriss, who's the prominent self-help guru, helped fund the study, and it was a small study. But you can see the data on the right, and the data on the right suggests that post-treatment, there was a significant benefit that lasted up to a year. But masked in that study is more important data. These are the individual responses. So it didn't work for everyone. Some patients, it worked miraculously for, and if you look at like the red line at 12 months, were not depressed at all. Other patients, like the dashed purplish blue line at the top, had no benefit and might have even come out further behind at a year. Nobody knows exactly why, but it's important to remember there are two likely possibilities. One could be set and setting, a combination of the mindset or the underlying genetics of the patient, or the underlying outlook of the patient in the context they experience the substance. Or the other could be that depression is not a disease, but a syndrome, meaning it is a number of different genetic phenomena with similar manifestations, and we yet don't know how to tell them apart and break them down into specific diseases because they all look similar to us. And psilocybin or hallucinogens may help with some of these forms of depression, but not other. The verdict is still out. But on the aggregate, it seemed to help more people than it didn't. The question you really don't want to know, though, is, does psilocybin help with depression? You want to know, does it help more with depression than drugs that are currently on the market? And there are at least two studies which suggest that it may. So one is a study where they compared psilocybin against the traditional SSRI Lexapro for 6 weeks. And the psilocybin group did either as favorably or better in the trial. And secondly, another study by Davis reported that 71% of patients with MDD given psilocybin showed a greater than 50% reduction in symptoms, and half weren't depressed at all at 4 weeks. And what makes this significant is twofold. Not only is it a better outcome than any of the current pharmaceuticals on the market, but it's faster acting than the pharmaceuticals currently on the market. Most antidepressants now take somewhere from 4 to 6 weeks to work, and increasingly there is some data that psilocybin and psychedelics work more quickly. It's not necessarily an instant cure, but it's a more rapid cure for people who are suffering. Another area you might look at is anxiety. The strongest data for psychedelics and anxiety are for patients with life-threatening conditions such as cancer or other terminal illnesses. And NYU has done studies that both showed immediate and long-term relief for such patients. More recently, a smaller study for patients with severe OCD showed a remarkable decrease of anywhere from 23 to 100% in their OCD symptoms by the most commonly used measure after 24 hours. Not only do you get a response, but you get a rapid response, according to these, I want to emphasize, very small selective studies. And you can see the trend on the right, which is, by psychiatric standards, rather radical. Historically, and quite ironically, considering that psychedelic use increased rapidly at the same time that marijuana and illicit substance use increased during the 50s and 60s, psychedelics were thought to be effective in treating various substance use disorders, most notably those for alcohol and tobacco. And in one very well-known study, 10 subjects with severe alcoholism were given psilocybin after being observed for 4 weeks. And as you can see on the right, psilocybin both reduced their drinking days and their heavy drinking days substantially over a 36-week period. Similar impact for tobacco. Johnson and colleagues gave psilocybin to 15 heavy smokers who had tried many times before to quit, and at 6 months, 80% of them were abstinent, compared to 35% for other methods, and they used biomarkers, not self-reporting, to determine efficacy, so it wasn't simply that people more likely to use psilocybin were also more likely to lie. Interestingly, although it is well known that PTSD has been studied in relation to psychedelics, the data from animal models is really what this relies on. And there's data from animals showing that psilocybin can extinguish fear response in the hippocampus of the brain. Tom Schroeder, in his LSD, Ecstasy, and Power to Heal, writes a lot about PTSD and psychedelics. The current focus has been largely on ketamine and MDMA, but case reports are starting to suggest psilocybin has promise. It was used in the Netherlands in the 1970s with reported good effects. And yet, I should emphasize, while touted in the media, the data does remain extremely limited. But here's the most important transformative aspect of psilocybin for medical use, and that is in personality studies. So Roland Griffiths has reported significant lasting personality changes as a result of supervised psilocybin use. He gave 2 doses of psilocybin to 50 healthy adults and tracked what are known as the big 5 personality traits. And those are neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And what he found was a significant increase in openness. And what's more important, it was not correlated with initial levels of openness. So in essence, he answered the question, does the openness come first or does the psilocybin come first? And the answer seems to be the psilocybin comes first. Why does this matter? Because personality change is extremely difficult to generate. People go to psychotherapy for their entire lives to generate personality change. People with personality disorders, as they're known, or personality psychopathology, struggle intensely to change their character structure. If there were a way, not even to change their structure, but simply to open them up to other therapies that might help them change their structure, this would be a game changer in the treatment of personality disorders. And that's a picture of Roland Griffith, looking very happy about what he's done. There's some data to show that psilocybin also can improve medical problems. Headaches, for example, have been responsive both for migraine and for cluster headaches. And some data to suggest that it may be beneficial for chronic pain, but clinical trials are still lacking. So I've given you about half an hour of good news. Now I have to give you some bad news. And the bad news is even though psilocybin and psychedelics have all this promise, they are still highly regulated by the government. Research is substantially limited. And it's going to be a long time before we have more concrete answers to a number of these questions. So what I want to talk about now is where does the law stand on the regulation of psychedelics? How did we get there? And where are we going from here? So I want you to start back in what is known as the pre-regulation or patent medicine era. This was the free-for-all of the 19th century. These are some advertisements for various medications in the days before either the federal government or the states regulated the contents of medication. And you can see that there, in addition to manufacturing aspirin, manufactured heroin hydrochloride, probably also helped with headaches, but had other side effects. You could buy cocaine tooth drops. You could have your cancer cured in a pill. You could buy cannabis extract, cannabis americana, all of them over the counter at your local drugstore. The only effort to regulate medication in the United States meaningfully prior to the 20th century occurred in the early 19th century as a result of the Vaccine Act of 1813. And they should be reminiscent of some events of the recent COVID pandemic. There were individuals trying to sell fake smallpox vaccines. And the federal government cracked down on this in 1813, then repealed their own law in 1822. And from that point forward until the 20th century, regulation of medication was largely left to the states, which was challenging because companies used to manufacture products at a national level. All of this began to change as a result of a horse named Jim. Unless you want the evidence, there is a picture of Jim with his doctors right there. Jim was a kind, decent horse, we are told, who minded his own business, but he was involved in the process of generating diphtheria antitoxin to protect young children. And a young girl from St. Louis, a 5-year-old girl, received this diphtheria antitoxin. Unfortunately, what Jim was unable to tell anybody through his whinnies was that he also had tetanus. And this young girl contracted tetanus, and tragically she died. And 11 other individuals died as well. There was a similar episode shortly thereafter in Camden, New Jersey. And the result was the federal government, for the first time, got into the business of regulating drugs. And the first drugs it regulated were biological controls. And it basically assessed them to make sure that they weren't contaminated in some way. This led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, inspired by both The Great Fraud, which is a best-selling book at the time by Samuel Hopkins Adams. It was signed by President Roosevelt at the same time as other progressive legislation, for example, that regulating the inspection of meat. And enforcement for the act fell under Harvey Washington Wiley in the Department of Agriculture. And these were really thought as agricultural phenomena well into the mid-20th century. The primary purpose of the Pure Food and Drug Act, as it relates to drugs, including psychedelics, was it was an anti-fraud statute. It required the labeling of, quote, quantity or proportion of any alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, heroin, et cetera, or any derivative or preparation of such substances contained in them. So basically, you could sell anything you wanted on the open market, just had to tell people what they were getting. The government begins to crack down on the use of illicit substances in order to undermine organized crime, first by taxing narcotics under the Harrison Act of 1814, which, because of taxes, effectively bans the distribution of opiates and cocaine, and later does the same for marijuana and then alcohol under Prohibition. Marijuana is spelled correctly on that slide for what it's worth. You can see on the right, for example, there is Winston Churchill's prescription for medicinal brandy when he toured the United States during Prohibition, because doctors got into the business of prescribing alcohol. And one of the legacies of not allowing the prescription of marijuana and not allowing the prescription of other what are called Schedule I substances is because of the what were perceived as abuses or certainly uses of alcohol prescriptions during Prohibition. Most famously, John Davin was a cardiologist in New York City, and there were 2 treatments for a heart attack, myocardial infarction in New York City during the early 1920s. If you went to a hospital I will not name because of liability purposes, but I will hint that it was named after a great biblical mountain. They treated you with 6 months of bed rest, which was the standard of care, and which is what Clark Gable and John Steinbeck and later Dwight Eisenhower were prescribed, and thousands of people died as a result because they lay in bed uncoagulated. In contrast, John Davin was a Hopkins-trained pioneer, and he prescribed beer, and his patients did a lot better. Not, as I remind the medical students, because beer cures heart disease, it assuredly does not, but because prescriptions for beer were neutral, or relatively neutral, and lying in bed after a heart attack was lethal. Unfortunately, the legacy of doctor prescriptions made the federal government much more reluctant to empower physicians to circumvent the rules in subsequent acts. The first major subsequent act simply tried to keep drugs safe, and that was the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. It came about as a result of a tragic story in which the Massengill Company, which I believe is still in business, produced something called elixir sulfonamide, which consisted of DEG, which is a toxin, and raspberry flavoring. They did no animal testing. It caused acute kidney failure in the pre-dialysis era and killed about 100 people. And Royal Copeland, who himself was a homeopathic physician, lobbied both for restrictions and not to create exceptions for physicians. But it is the radical transformation in the early and mid-1960s that leads to federal legislation. And the most significant of the acts, I won't go through all of them, is the Staggers-Dodd Act. Harley Staggers was a sheriff in West Virginia, and Tom Dodd was a senator from Connecticut, and they were very concerned about the hippies they saw on television and in San Francisco using LSD, and they decided to crack down on their use by banning, through the Staggers-Dodd Act, the use of these substances. There weren't many teeth in the legislation, though, and it was 2 years later, with the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, that the government shut the floodgates. What does the Controlled Substances Act do? It sets up schedules. It says that basically a large range of substances are dangerous in one of 5 ways, from Schedule 1, that is the most dangerous, least useful, Schedule 5, that is the least dangerous, most useful. We often hear the terms controlled substances and scheduled substances thrown around interchangeably, both by doctors and by lay people, but they're actually very different things. Prescribing a controlled substance requires a prescription. It is something generally governed by the states. It does not require a DEA number. States, in theory, can determine who prescribes and under what circumstances, and there's wide latitude in enforcement, and some things can be shifted in some states for certain uses with less regulation. In contrast, scheduled substances are very tightly regulated, not just in their approval for market, but in how they are used by the federal government. And Schedule 1 is the most restrictive of these schedules. The principles behind Schedule 1 drugs are the drug has to have a high potential for abuse. There have to be no currently accepted medical uses in the United States, and there has to be a lack of accepted safety at any dose for the drug or substance under medical supervision. So that's pretty darn tight. What are examples of this according to the federal government? And I am not endorsing this view, I am simply parroting their view. Heroin, marijuana, psilocybin, mescaline, LSD. That contrasts, for example, with Schedule 2 drugs, which are heavily regulated, but for which there is alleged medical use, like methamphetamines, seconal, even cocaine, which can be used in microsurgeries. Research on Schedule 1 substances is extremely limited. A decade ago, Congress expanded this slightly by passing the Food Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act that allows the FDA to grant special breakthrough status to drugs that are Schedule 1 to expand some access. Though it's been very limited in doing so. It made the first grant in 2017, MMDA, which is the component in the street drug ecstasy for treating PTSD, but it has been reluctant to do so elsewhere, including for marijuana. It granted psilocybin breakthrough status in 2018 and continues to renew the status every year. The question is, if it continues to show such safety and efficacy through Class 3 trials, will it be reclassified? And the answer suggests probably not, because marijuana has been demonstrated in similar ways to show safety and efficacy and has not yet been reclassified by the FDA. What is the actual legal status of psilocybin? So at first it was legalized, quote unquote legalized, meaning decriminalized at the local level in a number of cities. These, as you will look at the chart, tend to be cities with very liberal young people, places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Santa Cruz, California. There is, I like to say, no political slogan, as goes Denver, so goes Seattle, that motivates voters to the polls. So this is unlikely to be a major voting issue for many people. Oregon, you will also notice, is in blue or purple, depending how colorblind you are on my chart, because Oregon actually decriminalized psilocybin at the state level. However, it remains federally illegal. So there is now a tension between Oregon's Measure 109, which passed in a referendum by a substantial majority, I might add, which allows personal use of psychedelics for personal development, including medicinal use, and the federal ban. And how do you balance these two? In other words, what happens when federal law comes into contact with state law? Now, the Supreme Court has already addressed this issue in a different context. It has already said, in the famous case of Gonzalez versus Reich, that federal laws governing medical marijuana, or the Controlled Substances Act rule against marijuana use, trumps medicinal marijuana laws passed by the state. So you may be asking, then why isn't the federal government going around arresting all the people out there using medicinal marijuana? And the short answer is, legally, under the Constitution, it could, but it has chosen not to do so. In 2009, President Obama announced the federal government would not prosecute growers, distributors, or users of marijuana who had legal authority under state medicinal marijuana laws. No such similar indication has yet been offered by the federal government, including the Biden administration, on psychedelics. So we remain in this no person's land, not knowing whether or not the government would enforce this law, which is problematic both if you want to do research and if you want to microdose in a legal manner. It also creates a challenge for providers, because what is the standard of care? What is your obligation to patients for a substance that some data may suggest is therapeutic, that in your state like Oregon, and I presume other states may follow suit, is decriminalized under state law, but remains illegal under federal law and the Controlled Substances Act? And we really don't know. Something to think about is one of the cardinal rules of medical malpractice is you can't contract outside of the standard of care. What does that mean in practice? Well, I will give you an extreme example and then a concrete, more practical example. The extreme example is, let's say at the Great Mount Sinai Hospital, we say, usually we charge patients full price and we do surgery with a scalpel and an OR. But for you, for a discount, we'll do it at half price in the lobby with a cleaver. Now, even if you fully understand that and fully agree to the risks, if something goes wrong and you sue us, we're still guilty of malpractice for dropping below the standard of care. And the standard of care is generally what is accepted by other physicians, what other physicians do. However, there is an exception to the standard of care, and that is known as the respected minority doctrine, or the two schools of thought doctrine, which says that if enough doctors out there, particularly thought leaders in the field, are prescribing a treatment, even if it is not the majority, even if it's not the standard of care, you still may be sheltered from malpractice if you endorse it. And this is the basis, for example, of a lot of treatments in complementary and alternative medicine. I will add, if you're the only person doing it, for example, if you're the only person prescribing shark venom for cancer, then you do not want to be doing it on your own as part of clinical care. At a minimum, you want to be in a IRB-approved research trial. And there's one third rule related to the standard of care that you should know about that creates a challenge or a paradox for providers. And this comes from the famous case of Ashraf versus Chestnut Lodge. Ray Ashraf was a nephrologist who checked himself into a very famous psychiatric hospital, Chestnut Lodge, in the 1970s at the time, and they gave him talk therapy for about 8 months. He didn't get better. And then he went to a different hospital, and after 8 weeks of getting pharmacological therapy, he did get better. And then he sued the first hospital, and he said, you should have told me that I could have gotten pharmacological therapy even if you weren't going to offer it. You had an obligation to let me know what the treatment options were. We don't know exactly how much the settlement was. We know it was large enough that several years later, Chestnut Lodge had been bankrupted and became condominiums. I mention all that because you have to balance your obligation to not break the law with your obligation to share relevant information with the patient. A number of states have enacted right to try laws, all the ones in green, as of the federal government, which give patients the right to try experimental treatments, even if the FDA hasn't approved them. And a number of doctors have claimed this includes psychedelics. So far, the courts have not seen this the same way, specifically because the federal government, the statute, says nothing in the law shall repeal or override the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. We actually don't know exactly where the law stands, and we're in a bind trying to find out. Why? Sunil Agarwal is a physician in Washington State, and he wrote a letter to the DEA asking whether, under the right to try law in his state, he had a right to prescribe psilocybin to dying patients. And the DEA said its position was that the CSA still applied. And then he sued, and he went all the way to the Ninth Circuit, the Appellate Court. And the Ninth Circuit, the federal courts, refused to rule in the case. They said basically that since nobody had been arrested or charged or prosecuted for using the substance, there was no case. And implicitly, somebody has to take the risk of doing what Agarwal asked about before anybody can rule about whether or not it's legal to do so. You can understand why most providers, not wanting to lose their license, would be very reluctant to take that step, and therefore we remain in this paradoxical no man's land. I will add, by the way, that there is some popular support for Agarwal's stance, noting that 8 state attorney generals, some very liberal ones and some very conservative ones, both weighed in on his behalf. So now, 3 cases to think about that show you why this is a complex problem going forward. So let us say Dr. Magic is a geriatric psychiatrist in Oregon, where psilocybin has been decriminalized under Measure 109. A patient presents to his office seeking treatment for depression in the setting of pancreatic cancer that has not been resolved with antidepressants or talk therapy, and the patient is a poor candidate for ECT to do his underlying medical comorbidities. Magic recommends psilocybin, and the patient purchases the recommended quantity on the market. However, the patient suffers who is naive to the drug, suffers an unexpected negative reaction in which he becomes paranoid and in panic runs down the staircase and breaks several bones. And the patient sues Dr. Magic for malpractice. Can he win? Should he win, or will he lose? So assuming Dr. Magic engaged in an accurate disclosure of the risks, the answer is maybe. And there are several questions that come up. One, which we've hinted at before, does psilocybin qualify as a treatment offered by a respected minority of physicians, or if the doctor and patient contracted outside the standard of care? And the answer is we don't know yet, but as the number of prescribers increases or recommenders increases, presumably he's less likely to be liable for malpractice. Secondly, can an intervention that remains illegal under federal law and 49 states, which may be the national standard, still qualify as the standard of care or under the respected minority doctrine in jurisdictions where it's legal? And third, what doctors think about most often is, will his malpractice insurance cover this claim? Because if not, he's never going to make the recommendation in the first place. Now let's take the opposite case. Dr. Magic is a geriatric psychiatrist in Oregon. Same patient comes to him under the same circumstances. Patient is a poor candidate for alternative treatments due to medical comorbidities. Dr. Magic does not recommend psilocybin. The patient continues to suffer from depression for another 6 months. In frustration, he seeks care elsewhere, and another Oregon prescriber recommends psilocybin, and his depression resolves within a week. Think back to the case with the nephrologist who checked into one hospital and got talk therapy, didn't get better, checked into another hospital, got pharmacological care, and then sued the first hospital for treatment. So the patient here sues, and again, the answer is maybe or maybe not when asked if this is malpractice. Does the evidence that psychedelics like psilocybin used in depression rise to the level where it's a reserved treatment yet, sort of like electroshock therapy, that a provider has to make the patient aware of, even if the provider does not personally offer it? And as evidence evolved, will this obligation arise at some point? Or alternatively, is the provider engaged in law-breaking by even making this suggestion? And finally, let us take the same scenario with a third case. Dr. Magic, in this case, recommends psilocybin, and the patient's depression does resolve. Unfortunately, the patient is subject to mandatory drug testing at work, and when his urine comes back positive for psilocybin, he's fired. He then sues both his employer and Dr. Magic for failure to disclose the risk. There's actually case law on the subject, a famous case of Employment Division versus Smith from the Supreme Court, which ruled that one could be denied unemployment benefits for taking peyote for religious purposes. Whether that principle would still stand today, the patient is likely going to lose will be sued as his employer and may be denied unemployment insurance. However, as a result, he may still have a strong case against Dr. Magic for malpractice, as it might be expected that a provider would warn a patient of this risk, and at the same time not be expected that a patient would foresee this risk. A patient or subject might foresee that being prescribed something or recommended something by a doctor with a doctor's note, he might be protected. And in fact, in the IRBs where I'm affiliated, we always make a point of telling patients involved in these sorts of studies, they should not assume that just because they're part of a study, they're protected under the law, and they should take pains to both decide whether they want to take that risk and to inform anybody who needs to be informed in advance that they're taking part in the study. I want to mention a couple of ethical challenges very briefly. First, there is a lot of opposition to various psychedelic uses from Native American communities, and including the Native American Council, churches, and other organizations. Why? Partly because they're concerned in the cultural appropriation of traditional Native practices. I will note though that some of the Native churches involved have actually appropriated these practices over the years, as in the ghost dances, from other Native communities for many years before them. And secondly, and probably more concerning to non-practitioners or non-members of the church, is the decimation of the natural substances and natural plants from which these products come, such as the peyote cactus, which produces mescaline. And in fact, this concern in part led Santa Cruz to repeal legalization of peyote after previously legalizing it in 2021. Second, there's the ethical concern that we're engaged in a mass social experiment, that we know about the effects of these drugs in limited populations on a small scale. We really don't know the societal impact of long-term use in a studied way. And maybe the culture in some way has already eclipsed the science. And finally, a subject that some of you may be familiar with already, but does not get much attention in the media, is the issue of equity and access. I want to mention first that there are groups of individuals, historically marginalized communities, who generally have limited options when it comes to access to clinical care, clinical trials, treatment options. They don't have the resources to travel for care. They are increasingly less likely to be included in psychedelic studies and have a challenge getting into them, and may have difficulty accessing care if these prospects are ever legalized. It's also worth noting that they may be the same groups of individuals who are more likely to be targeted by positive drug screens. But even on a broader level, people with access to social capital and power are far more likely to know about small-sized clinical trials, are far more likely to get access. They may skew the trials, but we also want to make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity for these life-saving and potentially revolutionary products. I will mention, by the way, I always like to share my final bad news. I cannot help you access the studies, although I wish I could. And the final bad news I like to emphasize is I've given you all of this good news about the prospects for these drugs. I want to now emphasize with a grain of salt or two that the data I've talked about remains experimental. There have been other very promising advances in medicine over the years, or seemingly promising advances that have not paid out. It could turn out in a decade, you were all listening to this lecture and laughing at me. I will point out that there was a time about 2.5 years ago when I answered a question at a one-day university lecture about the danger of COVID and said that there were other things to worry about back when it was affecting a small number of people in China, and I was clearly wrong. So I hope I am right about the prospect of psychedelics particularly, but we will revisit this in 10 years, and I hope I am around to give you a 10-year follow-up lecture. Thank you very much. And now I am glad to take any questions you might have. Hi, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that lecture. I realize that it is now almost 5 o'clock in the Eastern time zone, which means for some of you, I am the only thing standing between you and cocktails or possibly psychedelics. But if you want the authentic university experience like your children and grandchildren, you have to pretend that you've just woken up. I now want to take a handful of questions that have been sent in, and I'm going to read the question and offer some thoughts. So first, someone asks, are there any members of Congress that understand the issue and are working to change laws and facilitate and fund research on psychoactive drugs? How do drug makers and drug lobby view them? And that's an interesting question because psychedelics, more than anything else, make strange bedfellows. And one particularly striking example is the very conservative Texas Congressman, Dan Crenshaw, and the very liberal New York Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have united forces to try to expand access for PTSD-related research on psychedelics, particularly for veterans through the VA administration. And that's really the most significant step forward, and I believe an amendment is included in this year's defense policy bill. I also do want to call out by name in a positive way Jamie Raskin, who, although not particularly active on this issue, has been particularly active on expanding mental health resources more broadly in Congress, and has really become a point person in this area. Someone else asks, do you believe the FDA should accelerate the study and approval of psilocybin for the treatment of mental illnesses? Could it be a game changer in helping people suffering with anxiety, OCD, PTSD, and even psychotics who have been wreaking havoc with AR-15s? So there, to be candid, is very little data on psychosis prevention and psychedelics. But as I said, there's increasing data for other psychiatric disorders like OCD and PTSD. I don't necessarily think the FDA should fast track clinical interventions, but we do need to fast track research. Right now, research is still in its infancy, and it's easy to see that we do a few more years of very good research and make the regulatory process easier, and then we're ready to bring these things to prime time. You don't want to do it too quickly, because if something goes wrong or there's a mistake, you don't want to set us back a generation when the overall data would be good. Someone asked, is it possible to get medical permission to try psilocybin medically for chronic depression, and how to pursue this possibility? Unfortunately, in a clinical setting, it is very challenging. There are research protocols at a number of universities. I can't in the lecture tell you which one to go to, but you can look online and try to find research protocols you might join. To my knowledge, there are very few doctors recommending this clinically because they're uncertain of the legal status that they're going to face. It has been said that we have a mental health crisis in America, the third question asks. Most everyone knows someone with mental health problems: PTSD, suicides, homelessness, drug addiction, alcohol addiction. Couldn't all of these be potentially helped if psychoactive drugs were put on a faster track for treatment? What can be done to spur approval sooner than later? So I think that raises two important questions. One, there is a mental health crisis going on right now, stimulated by COVID, a lack of resources. Psychedelics may help at the margins, and I'm a big believer in their revolutionary potential. But it's important to remember that there are other bottlenecks too that we can address much more quickly. There's a dire shortage of mental health resources right now. It is extraordinarily hard if you are a middle-class working person to find a psychiatric provider. So other steps need to occur as well. But on the pharmaceutical level, I think these will be game changers, or have the potential to be. And I imagine sooner rather than later, the pharmaceutical industry will buy into this and bring some to market. Somebody asks, in states that allow psilocybin use by the public, would doctors be at risk for prescribing it for depression in a therapeutic trial? And relatedly, if a patient can obtain psilocybin without a prescription, would a doctor be at risk advising on use without actually prescribing it? And the unfortunate answer is the answer I give you as a lawyer, not as a doctor, which is we really don't know. There certainly is risk, but right now we don't know whether the federal government would take action. We also don't know whether if someone has a negative outcome and they sue for malpractice, whether or not they have a claim or not. So the law is very gray, and to some degree that is holding us back. One might argue in favor of liability protective acts, which the state or even the federal government could pass, that restrict liability in this particular area for fully consented patients, that then might create more incentive for people to prescribe or recommend. But I will mention that just because you're not prescribing something, telling someone they can use something or recommending it can still open you up for liability. The classic example would be, in a number of states, if you give someone information about physician-assisted suicide as a doctor, or aid in dying as a doctor, even if you're not doing it yourself or recommending they do it, if you're simply telling them you can go to Vermont and do it, you still may be both criminally and civilly liable. Are there other countries that offer such treatments routinely? If so, is there data that can be derived from these studies? And the answer is increasingly a number of countries, both in Europe and slowly in Latin America, are increasing and expanding access to these substances in very different ways. And some countries have never criminalized them at all. Unfortunately, there isn't much research data from abroad any more than there is at home. And I did a pretty good survey of the data from foreign countries that exist as well, and there isn't very much yet. I wish there were more. give people a few more seconds to ask some questions. I mean, the truth is, I am an expert on the legal and pharmacological aspects of this, but you can probably call your college-age children and they will give you all the more practical logistical answers, because there is increasingly wide, not just recreational, but quasi-therapeutic use in the community, which I see intermittently in the ER as well. Well, I see no more questions, which either means that you've already gone off to cocktails or you're going to do more research on your own. You should feel free to reach out with me with individual questions over time at my email. And I thank you very much for joining me.